remember a time where you sat around the table and left feeling like God was in that moment? Thanks for joining me today on the Parable Podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and this is our third installment of our collaboration episodes with Zoweh, a nonprofit mission that encourages men, women, and marriages by creating tools, resources, and community spaces that invite people to experience inner healing and intimate connection with God and with others. Today, we're going to have a conversation with Zoweh-speaking team member and poet at heart, Dana Andrechyn. She discusses how God, in a season of exile, she felt seen around the table.
To me, poetry and also setting a table and sitting at a table are ways for us to slow down, to experience sacred spaces, and to savor moments that God has for us instead of just running from one thing to the next.
Here's my conversation with Dana Andrechyn. Please welcome Dana Andrechyn. She is a part of the Zoweh team, and we are just so excited to have this collaboration as we continue to learn stories from Zoweh and each one of their members of their team, because this is what it's all about. It's the stories of God and what He is doing in others' lives. So, Dana, thank you so much for being here on the Parable Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. I'm excited to share.
So, Dana, tell us a little bit about yourself. What are you passionate about? What is your day-to-day like?
What am I passionate about? I'm passionate about my family, and one of the things that I love to do is writing poetry. For me, it's a way for me to be with God, to distill down into a few words or a page what I'm hearing from Him, what's on my heart, what I'm wrestling with, what I'm enjoying. I have a couple of grandchildren. One is 13 and one is 4, so a big gap, but they're a joy to me. I love to invite people into my space and to set a table. And I also love to sit at a table that's been set for me. And have you ever had the experience of getting up from a table or a time of being with a group of people, and you realize almost after the fact that you've been with Jesus, that He has been palpably in your midst? It's something that you don't forget. You smell the fragrance of it long afterwards. You remember what's been spoken about long afterwards. I've had some of those moments, a few of those moments, and they, to this day, have stuck with me. And I love to curate anytime that I can, or be a part of anytime that I can, anything like that.
Yeah, Dana, I love the table as well. I think that is one of my favorite places. And it could be like the picnic table. It could be the coffee table. It could be the dinner table. Food is always my favorite, but it is really the people that surround it. So there are times when I can look back and say, oh gosh, like that was such a special occasion. And usually sometimes it's impromptu. Those are like the things that just, I love curating a space as well. But I think once we have that home or that place that just people feel safe in already, that cultivates that layer of openness and willingness to share. That is special. Most of the ladies from Zoweh, they said, you are the person that gathered people at the table. And so I'd love to know, how did that get cultivated in your own life? Did you see that from parents? Is this something that you had desired from an early age?
Well, I will say at an early age, I had a stepdad who did not make the table a good place. He was military and I was a picky eater, which did not make for a good combination. And so I would often find myself at the dinner table after everybody left. And as I was older and thinking back into my story and thinking about this, it's interesting. I could have become a person who was like, you know what, forget the table.
Yeah.
We'll do takeout. I'm not going to even try to engage it. But there was something deeper in me that longed for a place to sit and to feast, to have our hunger satiated, to have our thirst quenched. So I remember in high school, I took a home ec cooking class, and the teacher that I had helped me to fall in love with preparing food and sitting around together and feasting on what we created, and great conversation. So I would say that, and then becoming a Christian and the idea of communion, and that it is a piece of bread and it is a sip of a cup, but it's also a dining experience. Jesus sat at the table with his disciples many times, and they celebrated Passover, and it was a feast. So the allure of all that created this hunger and this desire in me to replicate it and to enjoy whenever I can.
Yeah. When did you first really start encountering God in your life?
I could say as young as I remember receiving Jesus when I was a little girl and being loved by the pastor's wife at our church. And she gave me piano lessons, being seen by her. And there was a couple they were missionaries to China who were a part of the little church we were a part of. This woman, for some reason, saw me and loved me. I still have some of the gifts she gave me as a little girl. She gave me the Silver Chair by C.S. Lewis in 1976 and wrote in the front of the book. She gave me a beautiful teak and silk fan from China and a couple other things. But being seen as a little girl who didn't feel seen a lot, she was the face of Christ to me. So, all the way back then. And then my husband and I really gave our lives to God and started walking with him when we were pretty newly married, and we needed him in our marriage.
Yeah. It is seasonal. And I think that's the beauty of the table as well. Like, you could come to the table every single day, but sometimes it changes, or there's something that's happening in our lives where what you just said, like that feeling of being seen just allows us to open up in a place where we're allowed to let others in and let Jesus in. For somebody that is a real struggle for them to gather at the table, because I think the initial thought is, okay, well, I have to have the perfect food. I have to have, my house has to be in perfect order. What would be some encouraging tips for somebody trying to figure that out as we head really into the holiday season? Because that immediately goes to what people think about.
Well, I would say that takes the joy out of it. If everything has to be perfect before you can have somebody come over. I want my home to be welcoming, but it doesn't have to be perfect. For me, I love to have flowers. I love to have the table set pretty. If there's dust and stuff, I don't think people are going to notice that, honestly. If they do, oh well. But maybe it'll also make them feel better about themselves, right? But I just want my home to be a place of welcome in the atmosphere. I don't want it to be a place of perfection, because that is unwelcoming, honestly.
So how do you curate conversation? Because sometimes people feel like, I don't have the right words. So is there something that you do as you sit down to a table with new friends, old friends, that helps curate that conversation? We spent 8 years in North Carolina. We moved from where we live now to North Carolina for my husband's work, into this cute little village. And I met my next door neighbor, did not know her very well, and met another woman in our neighborhood who had moved around the same time as us from California. And my heart was longing for fellowship and for connection. So, and I'm an introvert. So for me to invite strangers to my table is an act of courage. So I found Shauna Nyquist's book called Bread and Wine, and invited a table full of women, a couple who I knew a little bit and a couple who I didn't know at all, to my table for a 5-week, let's get together and we're going to meet over this book. I suspected that most of the ladies knew about God or walked with God. So we ended up having a really sweet time. Of me going out on a limb, and we all brought a part of the meal together, and we would read a section of the book before we gathered, and we had the sweetest conversations. One of the women who joined us, she was a last-minute invite, and she had just gotten word that her husband of over 30 years was leaving her. And so she came in brokenhearted and vulnerable, like a beautiful, tender vulnerability. And her willingness to be who she was, where she was, opened up the rest of our hearts to be able to be vulnerable too. So it was really a holy time. And so that was one place that we experienced communion and fellowship and blooming friendship. And another really precious time was right as COVID was happening, right as the shutdowns, right before the shutdowns. A friend of mine who lived in my neighborhood got word that her son, who has struggled most of his life with addiction, was in a hospital and probably wasn't going to make it. So that was February of 2020. So she spent a couple weeks in San Francisco, and she walked her son home, basically.
he passed away. And then she flew home. She was in the midst of going through some other hardships in her life, and she was alone. And the shutdowns happened, and here's this sweet friend who is grieving alone. So it's winter, and there's not a table necessarily, but I gathered a few friends, and we had a gas fire pit out in the backyard, and we fired up the gas fire pit in the evenings, and we went through John Eldredge's book, Get Your Life Back. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah.
It's Everyday Practices for a World Gone Mad, and it was very timely just to be able to. Some of the chapters in there are benevolent detachment, drinking in beauty, allowing for transitions, which this woman was going through. All of us were grieving ungrieved griefs. And we would sit out at this fire pit with our coats on and have hors d'oeuvres and grieve with her. And she would tell us stories. And then we would tell our own stories. And we cried and we laughed, holy laughter at some of the funny stories of her son. And Jesus was in our midst. It was very holy, holy time. So that was another experience. I think of, it's in Luke 24, I think. Yeah, the road to Emmaus is a story that I resonate with over these table evenings, these table seasons that I've been able to experience. How these men walked with Jesus and he was telling them stories, and they didn't realize who he was until they invited him, compelled him to come to the house with them. And it says when he broke the bread, their eyes were opened. Yeah. And they knew him, and then he vanished from their sight. And then they said, oh my gosh, didn't our hearts burn within us when he talked with us on the road? Yeah. So those are the experiences that no one can take away from you.
Dana, I had a similar experience with the book Bread and Wine as well. My friend Jennifer, who also, like, it takes an act of courage to invite people in, and you just don't know necessarily what's going to happen. But we had a beautiful supper club based out of that book, and it was just a great season of walking with people. And I think when you're around the table, when you were talking about being seen, there is this community of knowing, like, my life's a mess and I'm not the only one. And I love how you brought the road to Emmaus in there as well, because there is the stories of our life. There is the constant story that is happening in the Bible, and that we get to be a part of that story as well. And so that's why I believe, like, we all have a parable story where we can look back and we can say, oh, wow, like, I have seen the lesson that you have shown me within from the table or through poetry or whatever. So Dana, I'd love for you to share one of your parable stories. And I know we're going to kind of do this a little different because you do have a poet's heart. So there's some poetry included in this.
Well, I can share a poem that I wrote about the table. And how do I want to preface this even? Because I do want to talk about another thing that the table does for us is, in one sense, we're all exiles. Eugene Peterson has a book called Run with the Horses, and there's a chapter in there called To the Exiles. In one sense, and in certain seasons, I think we all go through seasons where we feel more than others, like, oh my gosh, I'm in a season of exile. And Israel, they're in exile in Babylon, and there are false prophets saying, hey, don't settle in here because you're going to be going back pretty soon. And Jeremiah says, no, actually, you're going to be here for a long time. You're going to be here for 70 years. So this is what God says. He says, I want you to build houses and make yourself at home. I want you to put in gardens and eat what grows in that country. And the people had a very hard time receiving this word, but those who did, this is what Eugene Peterson says, and I love it. Jarred out of the everydayness by the exile, they embarked on the search. They settled down to find out what it meant to be God's people in a place that they did not want to be. And they did not lose their identity here. They discovered it. The exile was the crucible of their faith. They were pushed to the edge of existence where they thought they were hanging by the skin of their teeth. And they found that, in fact, they had been pushed to the center where God was. And so this is my hope for us wandering, sometimes people, that we would be a home to the exiles, that I would be a home to the exiles. And so here's something that I wrote a few years ago. It's called The Table of His Presence. There are no ogres here, or if there are, they are changed by the end of the meal. This is a place for those who hunger and thirst, a place to be fed, to be nourished. All are welcome here. We come in and sit down, bringing our joys and our sorrows with us. We come just as we are. The table is set with simple beauty, flowers and place settings, color, invitation, deep red wine, and warm, crusty bread. Garden harvest and roasted meat awaken us to our hunger. We dine in this spacious place. We dine on our sorrows and on our joys together. And as we do, magic happens. As we eat and drink in this sacred space, walls come down, wars are won, loves that were torn are reborn, and resurrection promises are raised. We don't want these evenings to end. We sit and soak in the broken bread and poured out wine. We marvel at the mystery of the presence with us. And after we are all poured out and filled up, the silence of the satiated radiates the healing and restoration that this table brings, and we linger in this holiness.
Dana, what was the season like when you wrote this poem?
It was the season that we were living in North Carolina, and it was a season where I was feeling a bit in exile and at the same time invited to intimacy, invited to solitary places and times. And so when there were opportunities to have times around the table, it was a joy to make the most of them and to invite God to be with us. And honestly, as well as I planned, he came and made the evening even more than I imagined it could have been.
I like some of the things that popped out of that poem for me is that we dine on our sorrows and joys and that walls come down. How hard is it when you sit at the table? Is that something that you've learned over time, like to allow walls to come down? Because we do have to be safe with the people around us. I mean, I could share everything, but I've noticed that maybe not everybody is like me.
Right.
How hard or how easy, maybe that's transitioned over the time for you, allowing those walls to come down at the table?
Well, I think that it takes discernment. You have to ask God, how safe am I with the people at the table? And how far can I share? What's safe to share? What will be received well? And you can maybe drop a few hints or lines in the water and see how people respond and go forward or stay right where you are, depending. But I would say you do want to guard your heart. When I had the table of women that I didn't know, I don't remember the details. I just remember we were all somewhat guarded. And our one friend, she's the one who decided to be vulnerable, and she was safe, thankfully, with us, with her story and what she was walking in. But test the waters. For sure.
Another point you'd put in there is like poured out, but then also filled up. And I think that is a good indication of like who you want people to be at your table, because there's so many times that we are pouring out, but there is no filling up in return. What are your thoughts on that?
To me, when you just said that, my mind immediately went to having a servant's heart to serve. You can do it from a place of duty, or you can do it from a place of love and expectation. And when I set a table, I often find from a heart of expectation, I often find that I am filled up. I want my table to be a place that nourishes and that people feel welcome, and for all of us at the table.
I think in a culture that there's such a speed to our life, community has been, as much as people want to be connected. If you think of social media, we are very connected, but we really truly don't know anything about each other.
Right.
Or you only see a portion of that. You talk so much about in the beginning, like as a child, you wanted to be seen and you felt like your piano teacher did that for you. Why is the table so important for community and to understand like that seenness in others?
Well, I believe that we were created for community. We bear the image of God, who is Father, Son, and Spirit, and they're a community within themselves. We're created in their image, and I think it's just in us. That's what we're made for, and that's what we are on the search for, and especially connected fellowship in the Spirit, right? Fellowship with the Father, Son, and Spirit. We're made for it.
You have a poet's heart. That's what you said, and I think that's a beautiful description. I'd love for you to kind of explain when you have time to sit and to be with Jesus. And I think that for me, there was an idea of like, this is how I need to go to God every day. This is my devotional. This is my chunk of the Bible verse that I need to sit with. And I have to do that at 5 a.m. That has kind of been broken over time, and just trying to help people understand there is so many more ways that we can discover and have a relationship, a table conversation with God in our life. Mm-hmm. So how did you discover poetry was that place for you, that you met God in that moment?
Well, a friend of mine many years ago when we lived in Virginia back in the early 2000s, she introduced me, probably, I give her credit, to poetry in a way that I began to love it by listening to poetry, looking at art, and then responding to it by writing something ourselves. And she did a couple of 8-week courses I think it's called Creative Lectio. So that actually put something in me that over the years has come to mean so much to me. And then about a year ago, I went through a year-long course called School of the Spirit. And it was a year-long program, basically, where you just learned Lectio Divina and, silence, the gifts of silence and solitude. And those were soaking times with God, where ungrieved griefs would come up in me, or beautiful thoughts that God was inviting me into. And to stay with that, and I love to journal, but to distill things down. How would you say that in a page? Mm-hmm. How has my heart been met in a page? How have I walked through a little bit of grief to the other side? What is God saying? And my mornings will tend to be the outpouring of that on the page. I'm in a little bit of a mess. And then over the next days, I'll shape what I feel like God is downloading and what God is walking with me in.
I love that.
Thanks.
I think that gives such clarity for someone. I was just talking with our youth pastor, and so they're working through the Bible and going through the book of James. And I asked them, do you know what everyone's learning style is? Because I think once you understand a little bit of how you learn, not everyone is a reader. Not everyone is a writer. Some people are auditory or visual. So once you can open your mind up to, okay, this is not the only way to have a relationship with God. He's like everything, he's all of those things. So what is something where he is just waiting for you to pull up a chair to his table and to dive in? So that's so exciting, because you just said that was early 2000s. So this wasn't when you were 7 years old. This was something that you learned later on in life. And here has opened up a whole new expanse of God and who he is. So I think that's so exciting, and that gives such encouragement for those that are listening, because it's not over. Just because this doesn't work for you, try again.
Right. And you talked about how we live in this world that's so fast paced. And to me, poetry and also setting a table and sitting at a table are ways for us to slow down, to experience sacred spaces, and to savor moments that God has for us instead of just running from one thing to the next. Yeah. And I did want to say, since we've been back, we have old friendships that we've picked up again. Well, haven't really ever dropped, but there's 4 couples that we meet every Friday night, and we have dinner every Friday night, and we meet from house to house, and it's a slow evening. The person who hosts makes the main meal, and the rest of us bring a part. But the table's always set. The food is always delicious. The fellowship is precious. And we're a group of people who we're all carrying things, joys and pain, different griefs, different longings. And we bring these things to the table together. And it's really every week that we go, we don't regret being there. We're walking with people through life, and it's precious. Yeah.
Dana, how did you get connected with Zoweh? Is that something that you attended or you were familiar with? What was your initial start with them?
So my husband and Michael, Robin's husband, met. I think they first met at a Wild at Heart conference out in Colorado. And then somehow they got connected again. And my husband had a nonprofit for a little while and was doing men's retreats with a guy called Gary Barkalow, who has a ministry called The Noble Heart. And so through that, they became friends and did things together. And then they both said, hey, our wives need to meet each other. And so we had them to our house and invited them to speak at an event that we were hosting. then Robin invited me to the deepening weekend, which I attended. And I remember them saying, Dana, do you want to have a part in this? And I'm like, nope, no, thank you. And they asked me a few times. And then the last time they asked me, I knew God was inviting me. He was asking me. And so I said, yes, I will do this. And I think that was 2012 was the first time I spoke at one of the weekends, and have been ever since, and have become good friends with these people. And it's been really good.
You said earlier that you're very much an introvert. So was the reasoning of like asking to be in one because you're like, oh, I don't want to public speak. I don't want to be the center of attention. I don't know if like my voice has something to offer. What was going through your head when you were asked and you're like, maybe not yet?
All of those. Yeah. And then behind that, the still small voice of God, I have something for you if you'll say yes. Yeah. If you'll be courageous enough, I have something for your heart. And would you even do this if it's just for an audience of one? That's where the yes comes in.
I mean, just for the few women that I've talked to at Zoweh that know you, like they have heavily been impacted by your story, your words. So knowing that and just like saying yes to God in these seasons, at these tables, at these retreats, what has God taught you through this season of your life by helping with Zoweh?
Well, He has taught me that I have a story. I have something to say. My voice matters. And I want other women to know that about themselves.
Same. Yeah, it is. It's so interesting that you say that. Like, that's literally what I would say exactly myself. But at the same time, there's been times, and maybe that's because I'm further from the table than I need to be for God's table. But I can tell that to ladies all day. But like, sometimes that's really hard. Like, that's really hard to say for myself. But if we go back to the table, I think that's when you bring that sense of vulnerability. You're not the only person that thinks that.
Right.
That you're not alone.
And that's the enemy that speaks to us that way, that would tell us that you don't have a voice, you're alone, you don't matter, nobody sees you. You know, as John 10:10, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Yeah. But Jesus says, but I have come that they may have life to the full. And I want to chase that.
Absolutely.
And I greatly admire your courage.
Thank you.
To do this. I don't know how many podcasts I've looked through I've listened to a few, but.
Oh, gosh. Well, thank you. And I've said this before. So those who are listening, like the podcast itself, like, you're like, who's going to listen? Why does this matter? Well, you have to, consistently fight back that mindset, because it isn't true that stories do matter.
Yes.
And and it's worth it. Like, you can see the ripple effects when you get a text from somebody like 2 years later and they're like, hey, remember that time when you said this, or I heard this on your podcast, or when I heard your poem? Like, there is ripple effects that is beyond what we can even achieve. And it's only God. Dana, I'd love to ask, as you think forward into your life, like, what is in the next 10 years? What is something that you hope to continue to bring more into your life as you go forward, whether that's in Zoweh or for your own personal faith journey?
That's a big question. I'm going to make you answer it first, because I don't know.
That's okay. Yeah. I'll answer it first. So it's kind of in conjunction to what I just said of, this question was brought up at a friend's 40th birthday party. And so they're thinking ahead of like, what is something you want to take with you or take away in the next 10 years? And, for me, it is like trying to tamp down those thoughts of when I'm like, is this good enough? Like, do I need to work more? Do I need to prove myself more? And to say, you know what? No, like, that voice is untrue. And I want to bring more joy. I want to bring more relationships to the table, because I've really learned that community and building that community is what I love most. How I grow in my faith is in physical contact and relationship with others.
Yeah. Whatever more God has for me, that's what I want. I want to be willing to say yes because I've seen the gift of saying yes. Mm-hmm. It's a stretching experience to say yes in places that are hard to say yes in a good way. I do have a desire. I have well-worn paths that I walk here now that we're back in Virginia. And I do have a heart. I do say to God, what do you have for me? What new, what more, what friendships do you yet have for me that I'm not fully engaged in? I did invite some women about a month ago for a dinner at my house while my husband was out of town, and a couple women that I don't know very well were at the table. And so, yeah, I'd like to do more of that. More continuing to write. I was just in a season, honestly, all summer after the Women's Deepening Weekend at Zoweh, which involved a lot of writing and a lot of pouring out. All summer long, I couldn't for the life of me string together a poem. Oh. And somebody said to me that you're in a fallow place and that's okay. And I'm like, okay, what does fallow mean? So I love words. So fallow is, I think it's a term that was coined when maybe it was somewhere around the Dust Bowl era when farmers didn't let their fields rest and then they didn't produce good crops. So when you let the soil rest, it does what it needs to do so it prepares itself to reseed again so that it can sprout and flourish and produce a crop. So I just loved the idea of it's okay to be in a place where you're fallow, where it doesn't seem like much is going on, but things are happening. You just can't see it. So I want to be able to be okay in those seasons in the years to come and trust that God is at work in ways that I can't yet see. That's a practice.
Yeah.
And we're in a season right now. My in-laws are living with us. They moved. It'll be almost a year in December. My father-in-law is 98, has dementia, and we are experiencing really precious moments with him. He's just so tender-hearted most of the time and funny at others and inappropriate at times, which is also funny, especially around the things of God. His heart, he'll often be in tears. I prayed the other night before we ate, and I was thanking God for him and his wife and them being with us and praying for grace and mercy. And at the end, he was looking at me and crying, and he lifted my hand to his mouth to kiss my hand, and as his way of saying, And so just savoring. I want to live in the present moment, savor. If I can be really honest, yesterday, my husband and I were out. I had to take him into town. I had a very full day to drop off his car. And on the way back, he decided to take a detour into the countryside, and we got lost. And then I ended up getting mad.
Yeah.
And I had to apologize later, and then he got mad at me. And this morning I'm like, you know what? I missed an opportunity yesterday to be where we were and to be present because I was living in what was next. Yeah. And so I don't want to live that way. We could have had a sweet, beautiful ride in the country. And it was funny because he got lost and then we ended up at a roadblock and we had to completely turn around and then we got lost again. And then when we found the road that we knew, we were behind a truck that was painting lines on the road. And we started laughing. We're like, this is a divine setup. But
oh gosh, that is so true. The idea of being present and what you just said of like, you're in the moment, but you're already thinking ahead. And there's so many times I think I miss because I'm just like going, and I'm working on a message right now about joy. And it's like, how often do we miss that joy in our life that's everywhere because we are just constantly going. So that's really great. I love that. Final thought, as you are continuing to work with Zoweh and you're on their speaker team, why would a woman come to the Deepening Weekend? Like, what would you say that this is going to be one of your takeaways from this moment? I invited a friend of mine who's a young mom to come to the March retreat that we had. And I think she came with fear and trepidation. What am I getting myself into? Because women's retreats haven't always been great for her. And a lot of women say that actually, that they come to women's retreats and they're like, oh, I didn't come away feeling encouraged. I would say one of the biggest things that people love is that we set the weekends up with a lot of free time and a lot of silent time that you get to go out, and after you've heard a message, you get to go out and journal and be with God in a beautiful place.
Lord, what are you saying to me? It's a weekend where we talk about why we were made and what happened to us. Mm-hmm. Why are we not living the life that we think we should be living as believers? And we go back into our stories of harm, which often happen in our childhoods, not always. And then we talk about what does the offer of healing look like? We talk about what's the glory of our life, and every single one of us is born to bear God's glory. And it's a phenomenal weekend, and people leave encouraged. And I would just strongly say, come, you won't regret it. It's a wonderful time away. And every time I come, even being the one who's a speaker, I always come away with something new, being filled, being in awe of God.
That's lovely. Yeah. I think just retreats, they give you that uniqueness from your day to day where it truly allows you to slow down. At least that's what retreating should do, to really be with God. And so that's exciting to hear that is what the Deepening Weekend is about. And they'll get to meet you, Dana. So, so thank you so much for sharing part of your story today and your poetry and encouraging us to, have a perspective of the table, how we can gather and expect God to be there in those moments, because it is such a treasure. So if people wanted to get connected with you or learn more about Zoweh, how can they do that?
If people want to learn more about Zoweh, they can go to our website, Zoweh, ZOWEH.org. And if someone wants to get in touch with me, they could email me if they want to. I'm Dana, DANA, at Zoweh.org, ZOWEH.org.
Well, all of Dana's information, Zoweh, and the books that we talked about today, everything is going to be in the show notes. And so, Dana, thank you so much for your heart and sharing with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for your heart, too. Thank you so much.
I truly hope you felt like you grabbed a chair and was around the table with Dana. She is one of those people you feel immediately connected with, and I'm grateful for her voice. To connect with Dana or to discover more about the Deepening Weekend or Zoweh, simply visit DanielleZapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Dana. Number 1, what does the table look like? Or how can you set and prepare the table for you and God daily? Number 2, Dana shared about distilling words or thoughts that she had down. What are some words or ideas from this episode that you can take with you this week and journal about to discover more? One easy way you can support the Parable Podcast is simply by sharing this episode with a friend. If you could pass that along today, that really helps people find out about these amazing parable stories and know that they are not alone. And thank you to my technical producer of a husband for his fabulous editing skills. That is going to do it for today. I'm grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how God sees you at his table. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.